Hey, thanks for tuning in. In this video we're going to talk about reasons for commands and some problems with them. Now, this is an issue that I've been thinking about for a while, and I don't think it gets anywhere near the attention it deserves. In fact, I don't know that I've heard anyone actually address it directly in the field of biblical studies and of Torah observance. So I'm going to be spending some time today telling you about some problems that we get whenever we get into learning about reasons for commands, non-textual reasons for why commands exist, or meanings behind commands, meanings that the text might not actually say. So we're going to be talking about and discussing the issue of reasons for commands. Now, all of us come from different cultures, different backgrounds. Probably a lot of us were raised in Western culture, and most of us were not raised according to the Torah. Most of us were raised in kind of modern Western society instead. And so all of us are bringing in all of these experiences we've had and all of this teaching from society that we were raised in. And so the way that we view the world tends to be through that lens. It's not through the lens of the Torah, even though we're working on that as we learn the law. Typically, it still comes from all sorts of experiences that we've had in the world and kind of assumptions about how the world works. Now, when we get into talking about the meaning of commands and the reasons for commands, people want to know why. People are asking, why is it that we're told to do this command? Why is it that we're told not to? What is the meaning of this ritual? What is the meaning of this prohibition? And we want to understand so we can work that into our understanding of the world. Now, what I've observed is that people typically don't ask about what is the meaning behind being told to not murder someone, or what is the reason why we're commanded to not steal. People don't typically ask those kinds of questions. They want to know why regarding other questions. And I think that's because we already have those understandings built into us from society, that we've already been accustomed to accepting that as kind of a self-evident truth. That's the way that culture and society has taught us to already assume and already believe. So we don't need to know why for those things. We want to know why for the things that don't fit with our view of the world. Things that maybe conflict with some experiences that we've had in the past or some learnings that we've gained along the way. Now, there are a lot of pros to having reasons for commands, to figuring out why, even if they're not in the text. There are a lot of benefits to it, and this is why people do it. For one thing, people often feel bad and they feel in conflict about a command if they don't understand it or if they don't think that they understand it. So if they're bringing in all this other stuff from their past, all these learnings from society and all of that, their past belief systems, they want to figure out some way that they can feel okay about the commands. They want to feel fine with doing what they're doing, and they want to think that they know how that plays into everything else. And a lot of people out there, they want to know why so that they can talk to other people. Maybe they aren't too worried about the meaning of specific rituals or something, but maybe they see someone who is. And so, because we want other people to observe the Torah as well, and we want them to feel okay with observing the Torah, we might want to kind of step in and say, hey, I think this is the understanding that you need, or I think we should view the command through this way, or I heard someone say that this is the reason why we're supposed to do this. And it makes sense that we want to do that because we want people to feel good about what they're doing and we want people to obey. Now, another option, another situation we might be in is we're talking to someone who doesn't care about the law, someone who thinks that what we're doing is stupid, or someone who has completely different beliefs and they think the Torah is wrong. We might want to appeal to them from what we perceive kind of a more logical, a more reasonable perspective that doesn't include theological things. So we might want to argue that, well, it makes sense that this command was given because of some reason that's not in the text, And therefore you can see that the Torah makes a lot of sense, and it doesn't matter if you believe in God or not, it should be obvious that it makes sense. So we want to kind of do that sometimes, and that's one reason why we might get into making up reasons for commands, or making up meanings behind commands. Now, although we have all of these great pros and benefits to having reasons for commands and coming up with non-textual meanings for commands, it's a trap. And I say it's a trap because there are 3 problems that can easily arise in regard to this issue. So, number 1, reasons confuse our understanding of what the text actually says. Reasons confuse our understanding of what the text actually says. Number 2, reasons can result in us obeying incorrectly. Reasons can result in us obeying incorrectly. Number 3, reasons can prevent us from learning. Reasons can prevent us from learning. So let's talk about these issues in detail. So let's start with number 1. Reasons confuse our understanding of what the text actually says. So when we get into assuming different reasons for commands, or if we get into explaining what we think might be the meaning behind different commands, it can confuse us and others regarding what the text actually says. Now, this problem can actually arise even if we know the text very well. Even if we have the text memorized, even if we have the specific commands memorized and actually can recite the text of the command, the problem is that we start getting these meanings, these reasons, worked into how we even view the command, and it becomes elevated above the command. Now, if we know the commands are important and we know the text is what is important, then how could it become elevated above the command? Well, we're using it as a lens with which we view the text. We're using it as a lens with which we view the text. So therefore, no longer are we out here looking at, okay, here's what the text of the command says, here's what it, literally is worded as, and here's kind of what I interpret that as being. No longer are we viewing it kind of at a distance like that. Instead, we're looking straight through, here's what the text says, and we just assume it's self-evident as to what the meaning is. We assume that kind of baked in to the wording of the text. And this can begin to confuse us, and we won't even realize it's confusing us. We won't perceive it that way. We'll think that we know what's going on. And the thing is that whenever we start talking about that command, or whenever people bring up the command, what we'll start to go to in our minds is not necessarily the text of the command. We won't necessarily be looking at exactly what it says. Kind of what we'll go to as a mental shortcut is we'll go to, this is what's going on, this is the meaning of the command, and this is what it really means, and this is the reason. So we'll start checking in with that instead of with the text. Let me give an example of this. Now, I've heard this situation in Christian circles primarily, but I've also seen it kind of work its way into some of the more Torah observant groups, and I assume it's just been carried over. But an argument that I've seen used before in regard to homosexuality, male homosexuality, and bestiality and that kind of thing, is that it's not natural. People argue that, well, we're not supposed to do it because it's unnatural. And people will use this argument oftentimes with people that don't care about the law, they don't care about the commands, and they don't care about God. And so they're appealing to this idea of things being natural. Of course, that's a vague concept to begin with, but we start viewing things through those frames. We start viewing things through that understanding, that lens of things being natural and things being unnatural. And we know, or we might know at the beginning, the text of the Torah doesn't talk about things in those senses. But over time, we start building that into the way that we view the world and the way that we view the Torah. So we might get into a situation where we're exposed to something new, like a new technology or a new behavior or a new culture or something, and we might look at that and think, that doesn't feel right. That's not natural. And we might start thinking about, it's not natural, it's unnatural, therefore there must be something wrong with it. And so, since we've built in this view of natural versus unnatural into the way that we view the Torah, into the way that we view the commands, we start to assume that the commands actually talk in this way. Now, we may kind of go through and think, are there commands that say this is wrong? Well, I can't think of any, but it still feels wrong. And so we start checking in with that feeling, because we've built up all these reasons in our minds, these meanings behind the commands that aren't in the text. And so it confuses us, and we go to this feeling, and we go to this meaning, and sometimes we start thinking, it must be wrong, there must be a problem with it, so it must be in the text, and we'll actually go through the text until we find something that we can kind of interpret into that. And people aren't doing this just to obfuscate the text or to mislead people. They're doing it because they think it's right, and they're trying to justify their feelings that they've worked into themselves about this issue. They're trying to justify it with the text. This is obviously a problem, and it's something that we need to deal with. Now this gets into the idea of confirmation bias, and make sure that you look into that if you don't know what it is. But basically, we start assuming things through a certain lens. We get this idea and generalization of how things are, for example, the natural, unnatural thing. And then, the way that we view the text from then on, if we believe it enough, we start to see evidence of that in the text, whether that evidence is there or not. And it can be difficult for us to separate from that. So confirmation bias is a big issue, and it comes into play in this regard as well. So these reasons and these meanings that we build up over time, they begin to confuse us about what is in the text, and we actually start to think about them as if they are commands, even though we might know logically that, oh yeah, it's not in the text, but we kind of bake that in and kind of assume, in the way that we process things with kind of mental shortcuts, we assume that it is in the text, and it's not. So let's talk about number 2. Reasons can result in us obeying incorrectly. So when we have all these reasons and meanings built up about commands, these reasons and meanings that are not in the text, we can kind of start ignoring parts of the command just because of projecting these meanings upon the text. We start to assume things about commands, and we start to ignore some of what is plainly said. There are a few ways that we can do this. The first way is that we start to project that reason upon the text, and we assume that the reason is the most important part. We start to assume that the reason of the command is the most important part. So this plays out, I've heard repeatedly in Christian groups, for example, the idea of the spirit of the law, starting to assume that this meaning that we think is behind the command is actually more important than the command itself. So we start to direct our attention based upon that meaning. No longer is it based upon the wording, but we start directing our attention based upon the meaning that we are assuming. Now let's look at some examples of this in regard to the tzitzit, or the tassels issue. Now the tassels command is kind of unique because it is one of the few that actually tells us the reason behind it, actually explains to us the reason. So if we look at Numbers 15, 37 through 41, it does give us the reason as to why we're to do this command. It tells us that the tassels are to be a visual reminder to us so that we will remember the commands and so that we will do them. Now, I've seen this reason, even though it's a textual reason, actually get in the way of observing the command, believe it or not. Now, one example of this is a meeting I was at recently. We talked about the issue of the tassels, talked about the issue of needing to observe it. But whenever we got to reading the meaning of it, when we got to reading the reason, even though it was a textual reason, this reason was assumed to be the most important part of the command, more important than the rest of it, more important than what it tells us to do. And so as a result, kind of the assessment of the command was, well, what's really important is just that we remember the commands, and it doesn't matter how you do it. Well, the thing is that if it didn't matter how we did it, then why are we commanded by God to do them that way? Why are we commanded to do them that way if it doesn't matter? So, obviously that doesn't really pass the sniff test, so to speak, but it does just fine for us if we kind of don't want to wear the tassels to begin with. So to us, it might seem reasonable in the situation, if we don't want to wear the tassels, to interpret it that way. And I've seen that also applied in other ways as well, assuming that, well, we just need some kind of symbol to see, and that's good enough. It doesn't matter the specifics of what we're told. So I've seen that play out, people just carrying tassels with them, carrying a single tassel that may not even meet the requirements, just as a reminder of the commands, and instead of putting them on our garments, instead of having tassels on our garments. And so that kind of begins to confuse the command. Even though it's a textual reason, I think that's a good example of how we can forget what's important about the command because we assume that the meaning is what is important. Another way that this plays out is that we can start to create new laws as a result of the meaning that we assume. So we all know about Deuteronomy 4:2 and Deuteronomy 12:32, which tell us that we're not supposed to add to the law and we're not supposed to take away from the law. And I don't think any of us are going out of our way to think, all right, how can we add to the law or how can we take away from the law? But it does go on accidentally if we put too much stock in reasons for commands. We can start to assume these reasons, and then we feel strongly about these reasons, about these meanings behind commands. And so if something comes along that doesn't fit with that, if someone's doing something that doesn't fit with the meaning or something like that, we can start to feel bad about it, and we can start to think, that's a problem, that must not be allowed by the law. So when we assume that, we're adding to the law if it's not in the law. And the problem is that we don't often know when we're doing that. But we need to be careful. Our reasons, our preferences, and our opinions are not the law. We need to be careful about what the law says. So let's go on to number 3. Reasons can prevent us from learning. Reasons can prevent us from learning. So when we accept these reasons, when we assume that we know the meaning behind a command, they can actually become obstacles to further learning. Now it's kind of interesting because a lot of times the reason that we want to know these reasons, we want to know why commands exist or why we're supposed to do things a certain way, we want to know so that we can learn how things work and we can learn to do the commands. So it's kind of interesting that it can become an obstacle to learning. So let's consider this. Think about 2 situations in your past wherein you changed your mind about something. Maybe you had some beliefs about certain issues and you changed your mind. Now, think of one situation where it took a while before you were receptive to changing. It took a while before you realized, okay, yeah, there is all this evidence, I guess so, I guess it is right, and it was really hard for you to realize it, and it just took a long time before all the evidence finally just piled up, and you just finally realized, okay, I guess there is something else going on than I thought before. Now, contrast that with a situation where you easily changed your mind. Situation maybe you didn't really have strong opinions about an issue. Maybe it's something you just hadn't really thought about much. And maybe if someone asked you what your opinion on it was, you might have had a general opinion and it wasn't really strongly felt. But say some new information came along and, all right, it was easy to accept. It was, well, the evidence is there. I guess I'll change my mind about it. And it's easy to do. And part of the reason for that might be you didn't have a whole bunch of reasons built up about it, and you didn't have a whole bunch of beliefs about it, about how it gave meaning to that issue or related to a whole bunch of other issues that you thought about. So if we build up all of these reasons, all of these ideas about why we think commands are given and all of that, it can make it harder to accept something whenever actual genuine evidence comes along. So say we have a command and we think we've got it all figured out, and we think we know not only how the command's supposed to be observed, but why it's supposed to be observed that way, all of that. And say someone comes along and says, hey, I've been looking at this command and I don't think we've been interpreting it right. I mean, look at what it says. Look what it says right here. I think we need to be doing this instead. And if we've built up reasons about it, if we've kind of thought a lot about this and think that we know what's going on, it can be hard to accept that. Even if the evidence is right there, it can be hard to accept it. It can be even hard to realize that the evidence is there. Because we might have the initial reaction of, okay, check this against the meanings that I've assumed, check this against the beliefs that I have about the issue, and doesn't fit, feel bad, I think I disagree, I don't think that's right. And see, the thing is that we're not, in the moment, we're probably not going to be thinking to ourselves, oh yeah, I'm just concerned with the beliefs I've built up over time. We're not going to be thinking about that. We're going to be thinking that we're legitimately assessing it. So these beliefs, these non-textual reasons and these non-textual answers for why we do commands can get in the way from actually seeing the evidence. It can be an obstacle to learning. And so therefore it can prevent us from learning a more correct way or learning to observe more correctly. It can be obstacles to us. So now that we have realized there are three problems with reasons, with meaning, with this why question, that is, that number one, reasons confuse our understanding of what the text actually says. Number two, that reasons can result in us obeying incorrectly. And number three, that reasons can prevent us from learning. I want to re-emphasize that part of the problem is that we don't know all the time that this is going on. A lot of times we don't even realize that we're doing this kind of thing. And so we kind of need to be vigilant about, what are we bringing to the table? And one of the problems with that is that we have to bring stuff to the table and we don't know what we're bringing. And it'll be probably years, many years, before we realize even half of what we're bringing to the table, if that's even possible. And there's kind of a necessity to bring things to the table aside from the text, because we have to have a basic understanding of the world in order to understand the text. We have to have understanding of language in order to understand the text. So we're bringing all kinds of stuff with that, and we don't even realize that we're doing it. So what I encourage is that we need to be vigilant about what we're doing and accept that we may have biases and that our reasons and that these ideas that we may develop over time, that they are potentially biases that are not correct. And we need to be careful about when we're listening to other people, because a lot of times they'll be bringing in things that may affect their interpretation just the same. And sometimes we'll be in a situation where we're just wondering how to understand a command, and maybe we've been struggling with some issue for a while, and then all of a sudden, aha! oh, it makes so much sense now. And oh, all right, I finally get it. That's finally been resolved. The thing is that we may have a realization like that, but that doesn't necessarily confirm its validity. It may not actually be accurate. So we need to be careful of that sort of thing and skeptical of these reasons and these ideas that get brought to the table. Now, the law does give us overarching reasons for why we're doing the law as a whole. There are a few commands where we're given specifics on, such as the tassels, distinguishing between clean and unclean, and the Sabbath, for example. But as a whole, we are told why we're doing all of the commands. And according to Exodus 19:5, we're doing it to be a special people to God, a special people to the God of Israel. And according to Deuteronomy 6:20 through 25, we do these commands so that it will be good to us and to receive righteousness. So we are doing these commands for our good, we're doing them for our righteousness, and we're doing them to be a special people to God. We are servants to God, and we are seeking to do what He desires of us. That is the overarching reason why we're doing all of these commands. That is the reason why. And we might just have to accept that we don't have full knowledge, we only have partial perspective of the world, of the way things work, but we believe in a God who does have full knowledge and who has told us how He wants us to behave. And when we desire to serve Him, when we desire to do what He has asked, we have those answers to us. We may not know why, just as it says in Deuteronomy 29, we may not know all of the details, but we know what to do. Now, the thing is that this doesn't always absolve people's problems and questions and their why questions. That people really want to know why. Just as we've talked about, we want to know why so that we can explain things to other people and to ourselves so that we can understand how things work, so we can feel good about what we're doing. And what I've seen seemingly as a result is that a huge percentage of preaching and teaching is almost entirely focused on trying to answer why questions. It's not even necessarily focused on how do we obey or what are the commands, but it's almost entirely focused on why we're doing what we're doing and the meaning behind what we're doing, or the meaning behind what the text says. Now, so people have been kind of accustomed to expecting from teachers, to expecting from people who are teaching the law or teaching the biblical issues to tell them why. People have been accustomed to expect that. And the problem is that people don't have a really good filter on knowing what is accurate and what is not accurate. That doesn't really matter. The facts don't matter to people in most cases. And so they'll go to someone and ask, why are we doing this? And if you tell them, if you're honest with them, and you're straightforward with them and say, hey, it doesn't say, I don't know, then they're going to just move on probably to someone else until they find that answer, until they find the answer that feels good to them. And it's not about the facts, it's not about what the text says, it's about feeling a certain way and thinking that we understand it. Now, despite that huge, hurdle in teaching, I strongly recommend that we maintain honesty and directness and be straightforward about the commands. We need to be straightforward about these reasons, about reasons that they don't exist. These reasons are not given in the text. We need to be direct about that. Now, kind of a temptation that might arise is that even though we recognize this, even though we recognize there are problems with these reasons and these why and meaning answers, even though we recognize there are those three problems, we can kind of still get into the trap of it and be like, well, I know that the text doesn't say this meaning, and this is just my opinion, but what I think is blank. So we can kind of preface it and be direct about our bias We can say that hey, I'm biased, this is just my assumption, this is just my opinion. But the problem is that when we're telling people this, if they accept that, if they think, oh, that makes sense, or oh, that resolves my question, if they think that, they'll probably delete that whole spiel you gave about, hey, this is just my opinion, it's not in the text. They'll probably delete that whole thing and they'll think, oh, I know the reason now. And even if you were clear, even if you were direct about it, now they'll think this is the real reason and that it's in the text, and it will go into those three problems just like if it had been not prefaced that way. And that also applies to us too. If we teach something enough, if we start to believe something enough, even if we have that clarification in our minds that it's just an opinion or something like that, or that we don't know, we start to kind of believe it and build it up, and we might logically know that it's not in the text, but we start to get into those problems ourselves. So in closing, I want us to be very careful about these reasons, very careful about how we teach the law, very careful about what we accept from other teachers. Now, we know that there are these three problems, that reasons can confuse us about what the text actually says, that reasons can affect our observance, and that reasons can prevent learning. Now that we know all those problems, I want to encourage everyone to not give reasons to people just to make them feel better. Give the reasons that are in the text, and don't give reasons that aren't in the text. We need to be careful about that, and we need to be conscientious of how we are thinking about these commands ourselves. We need to be conscientious to return to the text and to be open to the text despite what reasons we may have built up in the past, and despite what we may be bringing in from our past experiences and from our cultural programming. Thanks for tuning in and watching the video. If you found this to be controversial, or if you think it might be worthy of discussion, worthy of consideration, then you know some people that would be interested in that, and be sure that you share it with them. We want to discuss this issue, we want to bring more awareness to this issue so that we can be more mindful about the text of the commands. Now, feel free to like this video and subscribe if you have not already, so we can stay in touch and so that we can talk about more controversial issues, more Torah teachings, more Torah issues. So thanks for watching. Remember the commands. Peace.